go.
Okay, with the magic of new technology, we can now show you what we did. These cork handles are in place. They have Chicago screws for like a little rivet detail. So now we're ready to start on the bag or the little cube. Now, according to the directions, and I have already done this, but you want to put your fabric, your exterior fabric, onto your Shape Flex foam or your By Annie's foam. And you're going to follow the directions. For this size bag, I've marked my lines at 7 inches and 7 inches. And then I have marked them at 4 inches and 4 inches. So now we're ready to sew the sides. What you're going to do, once you stitch those lines, you're going to stitch on those lines, just according to that grid that's in the pattern. This gives the effect of scoring. Like if you were working with paper,
Yes.
you would want to score your edges.
Okay.
This stitching is basically your scoring. So now I'm going to put my right sides together, matching up my top corners. And again, these handy dandy Wonder Clips. And I'm marking. I want to stick my finger in here and make sure at this corner that this is nice and flat.
Yeah, you don't want it folded.
You want to make sure that that fold, you're not getting a funky crease there.
Sure.
So you're going to stitch those sides at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And let me get this one done.
I love your little clips bag too. Did you make that?
I did. That is a Peapod pattern. The pattern is called Peapod, and I believe it's by Lazy Girl. And that's kind of a fun thing because it does a fun thing with the zipper. Because if you notice, the zipper rounds up here at the top.
Yes.
So the zipper goes around in that circle.
Oh,
and it's really nice because it stays open. It's great for clips.
That's really cute. I like that.
Okay. So now I'm going to stitch this on this one at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And for those of us who only quilt, it's hard to find your 1/2 inch seam allowance. So I'm just better off to go here.
Is it marked out? Oh, you can set it on your machine.
I can pretty well set it on this machine, but
Okay.
it is marked. For my purposes on this machine, when my needle is in the number 1 position, the edge of this foot is almost the same as what a 1/2 inch is. And so for my purposes here, this works just fine.
Okay.
And here I am going to back stitch, and then I'm going to come forward. And I can stitch on my machine a little faster. Okay, I'll slowly go to the end, and now I'm going to back stitch.
So you can lock it in.
And because I want to lock this in, because we're just securing those stitches. Because that's the corner of the bag,
Okay.
or the pouch, or the little bin.
All right. And then you're going to do the same
I'm
for
going to
the
do the
other
exact
side.
same thing on this other end.
Okay.
And again, I'm back stitching. And when you're sewing, when you're doing that stitching that I call like scoring for this corners for where you're going to be turning, I find it very important to match my thread to my background as close as I can, because in this next step you're going to see why, because we're going to be stitching over those stitches, and you can see where you could possibly see some duplication of stitches.
Okay.
Okay, so now I've got my bag like this. I'm going to trim these two seams to 1/4 inch. So,
Do you need that? I'm going to shut it off while you
Okay.
trim it.
okay, so now we have finished our side seams. We've trimmed them to 1/4 inch.
Okay.
Okay. Now these on our stitching lines, or you've stitched along these sides, and when you do this background stitching, it's really important for your finished product, for the way you are going to like your finished product, is to be sure and get your fabric and your thread matched as closely as possible. Because what we're doing now is we're squaring off our corners. So I'm basically folding those to a triangle point. Okay, so it looks like this, kind of like a pouch. I'm going to take it and push it down and form the triangle, and then I'm going to try and line up the lines on both sides where I've sewn. I want to line those up and match those up as best I can. And I'm going to take a pin and put through and try to have it come out on the other side of my
Oh, it's
stitching.
pretty close.
This one is going pretty close. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. That one didn't. Try to work it a little bit and see if I can get it any closer. And then if you don't stick the pin in the right place, it's like you didn't do it at all. This one is matching out fairly well.
Let's see. Oh, I see that. Yes.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put these pins in place.
And you said normally you would want this thread to match the thread that you originally put your stitch lines in with, right?
Yes, so I would normally do that, but for
Okay.
my purposes today, because of what I was sewing, I have it matched to my lining fabric. Because again, my lining fabric, to help disguise your stitches, when you want to match your lining fabric and thread for top stitching as best you can too.
Well, sure.
Um,
And you
because
want
you
people
don't
to
want
see it.
You want that top stitching to blend in, because it's just better.
So are you going to stitch right on that?
I'm going to try to
Stitch
stitch
line.
right on that stitching that's already there,
Okay.
because that's my turning point. And again, I'm going to back stitch, because these are your corners of that little cube. And then I want to sew forward. And again, I want to follow along that line and stitching as best as I can on top of that existing stitching.
See if I can zoom in a little bit better without it blurry.
This is where sometimes it looks like you had really straight stitching. You may see some variation in your stitching. But again, if your fabric and your stitching on the exterior match, it's going to hide well. I'm trying to
See how she did that right there?
pull this
Pulling the pin out.
pin out so that I don't sew over it, because it really isn't good for your machine. 'Cause you could pretty well do a number on your machine if you hit a pin. There was a period in time at Purdue in their clothing construction classes, they said, oh, if you hit a pin, it's okay. Well, it's not. Okay, and you can see I tried to get as close as I could to that stitch, but I'm still off a little bit. But this is not going to matter. I'm not going to get myself all worked up over it.
Sure.
I'm going to turn around and I'm going to do the same thing on this other corner. And you can see it start to take shape.
Yes. Okay.
So I'm going to stitch down this side, and then once I have that done, we're going to trim, and we're ready to move on to turn it and go on to the lining.